now than Donald Trump. He's got COVID-19. He's in isolation with his wife, Melania. This is terrible timing for his campaign, isn't it?
We've seen 200,000 people die. And he has been trying to downplay this, especially, you know, holding these massive rallies. He hasn't been wearing masks. He even mocked his opponent during the debate on Tuesday for going there with a mask on. You know, it means he won't be able to hold these rallies. He's also going to have to, he's got a health fight on his hands, and he is a 74-year-old man. He is in a higher risk category. So the timing really couldn't be worse for him. Yeah, it's massive. And Shane, right, I think we fixed some of those tech gremlins now in the system. So welcome to the show. Tell me, from an economics perspective, we know the markets have already reacted pretty negatively to this news. What can we expect?
Well, like the Australian share market lost 50 points in 7 minutes after it came through, and the Dow futures is down about 500, and you've seen that through Britain and through Europe, and that's because there's just so much unknown, and that's what always sows these sorts of things about major political events, because you go into the whole issue, can Trump campaign for the next 2 weeks? Have other people got it? Does Mike Pence have it? Does this mean Nancy Pelosi is really in charge of the United States? 2 million Americans have already voted, and given where the polls are, it makes it more difficult for Trump to catch up if those polls are accurate. So huge amount of uncertainty, and that's fed straight directly into this situation. Yeah, well, 2020, hey. Let's go to the news that's dominating domestically today, and that is this New Zealand travel bubble. And Tams and Rose, I don't know if you caught the interview we did a short time ago with Chris Roberts from the Tourism Industry Council in New Zealand, but he was really pouring cold water on today's developments, saying he doesn't think any tourists are going to be coming over the Tasman. He doesn't think any workers will. Is this really a travel bubble? I've been calling it the quarter travel bubble because obviously Australians can't go there, and New Zealanders who come over here then have to quarantine on the way back. So to me, that's not a whole travel bubble, let alone the fact that it doesn't even include every state and territory. So while it's a really exciting development, and people like myself who have family in New Zealand, it's really welcome news. And there are so many people in that situation, whether it's going to be this, you know, amazing influx of tourists and workers that it's being heralded as. At this stage, I think some cold water probably is worth pouring on it. But as a Kiwi, I'm personally very excited, and I'm hopeful that this is going to lead to some more developments and put some more pressure on governments to start thinking about these things. You've got skin in the game there, Tams and Rose, but just to follow up on that, do you think when do you think Australians might be able to sort of go to New Zealand? Like, is the government hoping that this small step will build some momentum towards that? Look, I think they'll definitely be hoping that there is momentum that comes from this. But the reality is, when Jacinda Ardern announced this and she was asked about it, she said that Australia was pursuing a different strategy, and that's why they were still going to be requiring New Zealanders who go to Australia to quarantine before they're allowed back into the community. So the fact that Scott Morrison's been very clear about what our strategy is, that we're going for suppression rather than elimination, and New Zealand's gone a different route on that, although it hasn't been perfect, as we saw with the outbreak in Auckland. It does make me think that it's unlikely that we're going to be seeing Australians going over there anytime soon, especially if they're not going to be quarantining. Yeah, Shane Wright, what do you think about that? That is the big problem here, that we have an elimination strategy versus an aggressive suppression strategy. Can the two kind of meet up, and how much is politics at play here? We know that there are state elections coming up, a New Zealand election. What do you think? It always comes back to whether people feel confident about health outcomes. And yeah, governments may say, right, we have a suppression or elimination. Who knows, really? All sides are not quite completely honest on where they're sitting. And I actually noticed the Reserve Bank and the Treasury and APRA today put out a statement about a different issue, but they all said this comes back to the health outcomes. Funnily enough, Donald Trump contracting coronavirus might be throwing another spanner into that works, where the leader of the free world, okay, he has some issues around face masks and virus to begin with, but the fact that he has contracted this may
add into that uncertainty. And while Mick Gunner might say, yep, the beer's cold and the fish are biting, you need confidence. And we'll get into this shortly, but Josh Frydenberg in his budget next week is really going to be trying to get that confidence bug biting rather than getting infected by viruses, and getting that into the economic mindset of consumers.
Yeah, well, let's talk about next week's budget, Shane Wright. The government is touting it as the most important budget since the Second World War. Is that a dangerous kind of rhetorical flourish to, set up just how big this reform agenda is going to be? And I mean, how do the challenges compare?
Well, yeah, Ben Chifley had a slightly bigger issue, the fact that Japanese subs were in Sydney Harbour and people had actually, tens of thousands of people had died, as well as the mental scarring that goes on, went on through World War II. Funnily enough, I reread the budget speech of 1945 just this week, and you had Harold Holt having a crack at Chifley for the amount of debt that they were running, and that the budget was as scientific as a meat pie. I'm not sure how that rates as a burn in the 21st century, but it might have been high standards of the 1940s. Anyway, that's where Chifley was, and you come back to this point that Frydenberg does. His spending will dwarf what Chifley did, even in terms of proportion of GDP. And the interesting thing is, right, he's looking at a deficit somewhere north of $200 billion. And I can't believe I'm actually saying that. That's what we're going to be talking about for this year, and $100 billion the following year. What he has to make sure is he gets a lot of value for those big bucks, that he does get the economy growing exceptionally quickly, gets unemployment down, gets underemployment down. And let's not forget, we go back to late last year, it was October, the Reserve Bank had taken the cash rate to 0.75, saying that the underemployment rate was just too high, as well as the unemployment rate, wages weren't growing. Those issues haven't gone away, and they feed into the problems that are left over. And I notice even today the government's trying to talk up about how the economy's recovering from COVID. It hasn't got back to it still had the problems of late last year. They are still rippling through this, and there's still all these headwinds, no matter how many New Zealanders find their way into Sydney or a billabong up in Kakadu.
And I suppose that's a problem, isn't it, Tams and Rose, that we had the July economic forecast a few months ago, but all of the assumptions in that have been completely blown out of the water. So it'll be a whole new, fresh set of forecasts coming up on Tuesday, but there's still so much uncertainty, and one of them is Victoria.
Yeah, I think Victoria is obviously one of the big uncertainties, and you're right, ahead of that that July economic update, they were saying that Victoria was going to come out of lockdown. Well, Victorians are now in 10 weeks of lockdown, and there's no real end date for that yet. Obviously, as a Victorian, I'm really hoping that, that all my colleagues and friends are allowed out of lockdown really soon, but Victoria is a massive question mark here, and we just don't know. So it'd be interesting to see what assumptions they've made about Victoria and Victoria's recovery in this. I'll be looking in the fine print on that one.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately, Shane Wright and Tamsin Rose, but thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Jane.
And as we have been flagging, the budget obviously on Tuesday night, and the government is likening this challenge to the post-World War II challenge, and it's laid out a large reform agenda so far, focusing on things like fuel storage, energy and emissions reduction, upgrading the NBN, digital business plan, a manufacturing plan yesterday. But as Shane Wright was flagging there, we are expecting to see massive spending, massive deficit as well, to basically prop up the economy over the next few years before the government, whoever it is, even begins to think about budget repair. And of course, the trigger for that is when the unemployment rate comes back below 6%. Well, that is it for Afternoon Briefing for today and for this week. I wanted to thank our wonderful producers, Bryony Speed and Jade Clark, for all of their hard work behind the scenes on this show. Stick with us. Top stories are coming up at
On Q&A, it's one of the most important budgets in our nation's history. So what's in it for you?
We will be recalibrating our fiscal strategy.
There are difficult choices for the government and record debt for us. So how long will income support remain? And what is the plan to get Australia working again? There'll be some surprises for sure. It's your turn now to put your questions to the government, the opposition and the economists. That's Q&A.
Q&A, Monday 9:35 on ABC and iView.